"You're nothing but a burden," my aunt snapped. My cousin added, "No one would miss you if you left." So I did without a scene. This week, I got a voicemail that started with, "Please come home." I, 24M, never thought I'd be writing this. But here I am, sitting in my apartment 3 states away, staring at my phone after listening to the most desperate voicemail I've ever received. Let me back up. Growing up, my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. My Aunt Sarah took me in, along with her husband and their son, who was 2 years older than me. At first, I thought I was lucky to have family who cared. That illusion lasted about 6 months. My cousin Jake made it clear from day one that I was an outsider. He'd break things and blame me, steal money from his mom's purse and point fingers my way, tell his friends I was weird and damaged. But the real poison came from my aunt. She had this way of making every conversation about how much trouble I was, how much I cost them, how I should be grateful for the roof over my head. The worst part wasn't the big blow-ups. It was the constant drip of small cruelties. When I made honor roll, she'd mention how much the celebration dinner cost. When I needed school supplies, she'd sigh dramatically and mutter about unexpected expenses. When I got my first job at 16, she started charging me rent immediately, saying I needed to learn responsibility. I kept my head down, saved every penny, and planned my escape. College was my ticket out, and I worked 3 jobs to make it happen. I got into a decent state school with partial scholarships, but I still needed help with the remaining costs. When I approached my aunt about it, she laughed. She told me college was a luxury they couldn't afford, that I should be realistic about my prospects, that maybe community college and a trade would be more appropriate for someone in my situation. Jake, who was failing half his classes at the expensive private college they were paying for, just smirked from the couch. I found another way. Took out loans, worked nights, ate ramen for months. But I made it work. During those 4 years, I came home for holidays out of obligation, enduring the same treatment. My aunt would make comments about how college was changing me, making me think I was better than them. Jake would joke about my cheap clothes or my beat-up car. After graduation, I got a decent job in marketing about 6 hours away. I visited less frequently, maybe twice a year. The dynamic never changed. I was still the burden, still the charity case, still the reminder of tragedy they'd rather forget. The breaking point came last Christmas. I'd driven down for what I didn't know would be my final visit. Things started normally enough. The usual passive-aggressive comments about my life choices, my job, my apartment. But something was different this time. My aunt seemed more agitated than usual, and Jake was particularly cruel. During dinner, my aunt started in on her favorite topic, how much I'd cost them over the years. She pulled out actual receipts and bank statements, going through line items like she was presenting a case to a jury. Food costs, clothing, school expenses, medical bills, everything itemized and calculated with interest. Jake joined in, adding his own commentary about how I'd never really fit in, how I was always too serious, too different, too damaged by what happened to my parents. He said his friends always thought I was weird, that even now as adults, people could tell there was something off about me. But then my aunt said something that cut deeper than anything before. She looked me straight in the eye and told me I was nothing but a burden, that I'd been a weight around their necks for 16 years, that they'd sacrificed their own family's happiness to take care of me. Jake nodded along and added that no one would miss me if I left, that I should stop pretending we were really family, that blood was thicker than water and I'd never be more than an obligation they'd fulfilled. The room went quiet. My uncle, who usually stayed out of these conversations, just looked at his plate. I sat there for a moment, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity I'd never experienced before. I stood up, walked to my car, and drove home. I didn't pack anything, didn't say goodbye, didn't make a scene. I just left. That was 8 months ago. In those 8 months, I cut all contact, blocked their numbers, unfriended them on social media, changed my address with the post office to make sure no mail forwarded to them. I focused on my work, made new friends, started dating someone wonderful who couldn't believe the stories I told about my family. My life improved dramatically. Without the constant stress of their criticism and the obligation to visit, I found myself happier than I'd been in years. I got a promotion, moved to a better apartment, started therapy to work through some of the damage from those years of emotional abuse. I thought that was the end of it. Then, 3 days ago, I got a voicemail from my aunt. She'd somehow gotten my new number, probably through my job's main line. Her voice was shaky, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. She started by asking me to come home, saying they needed to talk, that family was important. But as the message went on, the real reason became clear. Jake had been arrested. Something about embezzlement at his job, though she was vague on the details. The legal fees were crushing them. My uncle had been laid off 6 months ago, and they were behind on their mortgage. They needed money, and apparently, I was the only family member with any financial stability. The irony wasn't lost on me. The burden they'd complained about for 16 years was now their potential salvation. But the voicemail didn't stop there. She went on to explain that they'd been thinking about me a lot lately, that they realized they might have been too hard on me growing up, that they'd always loved me like their own son. She said Jake was asking about me, wondering how I was doing, missing the old days when we were all together. I listened to that message 3 times, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite sort out. The next day, I got another call, this time from Jake himself. His voice was different too, smaller somehow, lacking the confidence that had always grated on me. He apologized for the things he'd said at Christmas, claimed he'd been drinking and didn't mean any of it. He said he'd been thinking about our childhood, remembering good times I honestly couldn't recall. He asked if I could help with the legal fees, just a loan that he'd pay back as soon as everything got sorted out. He promised things would be different, that we could have a real relationship now that we were both adults. Yesterday, my uncle called. He'd never called me before, not once in 16 years. His voice was tired, defeated. He apologized for not standing up for me more when I was younger, said he'd always regretted staying silent during those family fights. He asked if I could find it in my heart to help them through this difficult time. 3 calls in 3 days, each one more desperate than the last. I haven't responded to any of them. Part of me feels guilty. These are the people who raised me, who gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. But another part of me remembers every cruel comment. Every time they made me feel like an unwanted guest in their house. Every moment they reminded me I was a burden. Now I'm the one they're calling when they need help. The burden has become the lifeline. I've been thinking about what I want to do. I could help them. I have the money saved up, and it wouldn't destroy my finances. I could use this as an opportunity to rebuild our relationship, to maybe find some kind of peace with my past. Or I could let them face the consequences of their choices, the same way they let me face the consequences of being an orphan child who needed love and support instead of constant criticism. Update 1. I decided to call my aunt back yesterday. I needed to hear what she had to say, to understand exactly what they were asking for and why they thought I'd be willing to help. The conversation was surreal. She answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting by the phone. Her voice was immediately warm and familiar in a way that felt completely foreign. I couldn't remember the last time she'd spoken to me without an edge of irritation or disappointment. She thanked me for calling back, said she'd been praying I would reach out. Then she launched into the full story about Jake's situation. Apparently, he'd been skimming money from client accounts at the accounting firm where he worked. It started small, just borrowing a few hundred here and there to cover gambling debts, but it snowballed over 2 years into nearly $50,000. The firm discovered the discrepancies during an audit last month. They fired him immediately and pressed charges. Now he's looking at potential jail time unless they can pay full restitution and cover the legal fees for a decent attorney. The total they need is around $75,000. My aunt explained that they'd already mortgaged the house, sold Jake's car, and borrowed against my uncle's 401k. They'd asked other family members for help, but everyone was either unable or unwilling to get involved. I was, according to her, their last hope. She spent 20 minutes telling me how much they loved me, how proud they were of the man I'd become, how they'd always considered me their son. She said they knew they'd made mistakes when I was younger, that they were too stressed and overwhelmed to be the parents I deserved. She promised that if I helped them through this crisis, things would be different. We could be a real family. I listened to all of it without saying much. When she finished, I told her I needed time to think about it. She said she understood, but I could hear the desperation in her voice when she asked how much time I needed. After I hung up, I felt emotionally drained. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to think that maybe they really had changed, that this crisis had made them realize what was important. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just manipulation born of desperation. I called my therapist and scheduled an emergency session. We talked through my feelings, my options, and what I really wanted from this situation. She helped me realize that my decision shouldn't be based on guilt or obligation, but on what would be healthiest for me moving forward. That night, I made my choice. Update 2. I called my aunt back this morning. I told her I'd thought carefully about her request and had decided not to provide financial assistance. The change in her tone was immediate and dramatic. The warmth disappeared, replaced by the familiar edge I remembered from my childhood. She asked me to reconsider, reminded me of everything they'd done for me, pointed out that I owed them for 16 years of care. When I remained firm in my decision, she became angry. She said I was being selfish and ungrateful, that I was abandoning family when they needed me most. She brought up specific instances from my childhood, Christmas presents they'd bought me, school trips they'd paid for, clothes and food and shelter they'd provided, and calculated what she thought I owed them. I let her vent for a few minutes. Then I said something I'd been rehearsing in my head since yesterday. I told her that I appreciated everything they'd done for me as a child, but that their constant reminders of the cost and burden of raising me had made it clear that their care came with strings attached. I explained that healthy families don't keep running tallies of expenses or make children feel guilty for existing. I reminded her of the conversation at Christmas, of the cruel things she and Jake had said, of the years of making me feel unwelcome in their home. I told her that Jake's comment about no one missing me if I left had been particularly hurtful, and that I'd taken his advice. She tried to interrupt several times, but I kept talking. I explained that I'd built a good life for myself, that I was happy and healthy and surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide them. Then I said something that surprised even me. I told her that if they'd approached this differently, if they'd acknowledged the hurt they'd caused, made genuine amends, and asked for help as family members who wanted to rebuild their relationship, I might have considered helping them. But the fact that their first contact in 8 months was a request for money, accompanied by sudden declarations of love and family loyalty, made it clear that their motivations were purely financial. She was quiet for a moment, then she started crying. She said she was sorry, that she knew they'd hurt me, that she didn't know how to fix what they'd broken. She begged me to reconsider, said that Jake would go to prison if I didn't help, that it would destroy their family. I told her I was sorry too, but that their family problems weren't my responsibility to solve. I said I hoped Jake would learn from this experience and that they'd all find a way through this difficult time. Before I hung up, I told her that I was open to rebuilding our relationship someday, but it would have to be based on mutual respect and genuine care, not financial need or obligation. She called back 3 times after that. I didn't answer. Update 3. It's been 2 weeks since my last conversation with my aunt, and I thought the situation was over. I was wrong. Yesterday, I came home from work to find my uncle sitting in his car outside my apartment building. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since I'd last seen him. When he saw me, he got out and approached me with his hands raised, like he was trying to show he wasn't a threat. He asked if we could talk, said he'd driven 6 hours to see me and just wanted a few minutes of my time. Against my better judgment, I agreed to let him into my apartment. He looked around my place with what seemed like genuine surprise. He commented on how nice it was, how well I was doing for myself, how proud he was of what I'd accomplished. It felt strange hearing praise from him. I couldn't remember him ever acknowledging my achievements before. He sat down heavily on my couch and told me the rest of the story that my aunt had left out. Jake's gambling problem was worse than they'd admitted. He owed money to some dangerous people, and the embezzlement had started as a way to pay them off. Now, with the criminal charges pending, those same people were pressuring him for immediate payment. My uncle was scared, not just about the legal consequences, but about Jake's physical safety. He said they'd received threatening phone calls, that someone had vandalized their car, that Jake was afraid to leave the house. He looked me in the eye and said he knew they'd failed me as a family, that they'd let their own stress and problems turn them into people they didn't recognize. He said he'd spent years regretting his silence during those family conflicts, wishing he'd stood up for me more. Then he said something that caught me off guard. He told me he didn't expect me to help them financially, that he understood why I'd said no, and that he respected my decision. He said he'd come to apologize, not to ask for money. He spent the next hour telling me stories about my parents that I'd never heard before. How proud they'd been when I was born, how excited they were about my future, how much they'd loved me. He said he'd always seen my father in me, especially my determination and independence, but that instead of celebrating those qualities, they'd felt threatened by them. He admitted that taking me in had been harder than they'd expected, that they'd been dealing with their own financial stress and marriage problems, and that they'd unfairly taken out their frustrations on me. He said they'd convinced themselves that being strict and critical would make me stronger, but he realized now that they'd just been cruel. Before he left, he hugged me, something he'd never done before. He said he loved me and was proud of the man I'd become, regardless of whether I ever spoke to them again. After he left, I sat in my apartment feeling more confused than ever. His apology felt genuine in a way that my aunt's desperate pleas hadn't. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was still manipulation, just a more sophisticated version. I called my girlfriend and talked through everything with her. She pointed out something I hadn't considered, that my uncle's visit might have been genuine, but it was still motivated by their crisis. Would he have driven 6 hours to apologize if Jake wasn't in trouble? That question has been haunting me for the past day. This morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called a lawyer and asked about setting up a trust fund specifically for Jake's legal defense, with strict conditions attached. The money would go directly to his attorney, not to the family, and it would only cover legitimate legal fees, not restitution or other costs. But I added one more condition. Jake would have to complete a gambling addiction program and maintain regular therapy sessions for at least 2 years. If he violated those terms, the funding would stop immediately. I haven't told my family about this yet. I'm still not sure if I'm going to go through with it. Part of me thinks I'm being manipulated by my uncle's visit and my own guilt. Another part of me thinks that maybe this is a way to help without enabling, to show compassion without being taken advantage of. The truth is, I don't know if I'll ever have a real relationship with these people. Too much has happened. Too many cruel words have been spoken. Too many years of damage have accumulated. But maybe I can find some peace by helping in a way that feels right to me, on my terms, with my boundaries. I have until tomorrow to decide whether to move forward with the trust fund. Tonight, I'm going to call my therapist one more time to talk through this decision. Whatever I choose, I know one thing for certain. I'm not the same person who left that Christmas dinner 8 months ago. I'm not the burden they made me feel like for so many years. I'm someone who gets to choose how to respond to this situation, and that choice will be mine alone. The scared, grateful child who would have done anything to earn their approval is gone. In his place is a man who knows his worth, who has built his own life, and who can extend compassion without sacrificing his dignity. That feels like the real victory here, regardless of what happens next.